Well, Robert, this is it. The first time our listeners will hear your voice on the show.
That is not true. They heard me when we actually started this at the beginning.
That's
when we
true.
talked to Drew when he
the
was
torch
done.
was passed to us. Well, we just wrapped our last episode as the editors of the Emphasis Added podcast, and this is now our passing the torch episode.
It is.
So reflecting back on this year, Robert, can you tell me a couple of things that you really loved about being on the podcast?
Just hearing the insights from all the different people we were able to talk to and interview. From start to finish, it was always very, very interesting. A lot of great advice for at least the things that I try to take into account for myself, but I think also things that our listeners could use as well in their careers or as they begin their careers. And not only the advice from a career standpoint, but also just the very interesting issues that we had the opportunity to talk about and learn about even before we started, taking into account like Carol Rose or Chief Judge Rosenthal. That was like those kind of episodes that we got to kind of shadow Drew Padley in, or at least I did. Mm-hmm. But in our time, like Jordan Latham, Professor Kanaki, Travis Torrance, and Professor Turanian also, just like the vast things that we got to talk about, and just very, very interesting.
Yeah, and I'll jump off that and say I think this season, just the diversity of experiences that we had on the show with our guests. I mean, just going off what you were sharing, Travis Torrance is in-house at Shell. Professor Turanian is obviously a law professor. We had nonprofits on the show. We had in-house attorneys on the show. We had judges on the show. So, yeah, I think that was one of my favorite things too. Was just I got to learn about so many different types of career in law, and that's really encouraging as we are graduating and now facing down the bar exam. Well, we want to just say goodbye and thank you to our listeners for this past season. It's time to introduce our new editor, Kevin Donovan. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you so much, guys. Happy to be on the show. Happy to be taking over the show. Long-time listener of the podcast. Long-time listener of the podcast in general, I would say. And it's actually kind of funny for the listeners. Adrian and Robert were both tutors of mine my 1L year for civil procedure. And with all the COVID craziness, I think when I had talked to Adri to let her know I was kind of interested in taking over as a host, hearing her voice on the phone was the first time I had heard it between her as my tutor and me listening to like 10 podcast episodes of her talk. So I felt like I was on the podcast for a second. That's when I knew that I had to take over. So
Well, we're super excited to have you and super excited to chat a little bit about where you will be taking this show going forward. I think that's a great tradition of the 2 seasons we've had of the show so far, is that for each editor, there's a little bit different approach to how we do this and who we interview. So would you mind telling us just a little bit, what is your vision going forward for Emphasis Added?
Yeah, absolutely, Adri. First, I wanted to say for both you and Robert, I think you both did an excellent job. And I just want to acknowledge that. And, you know, I think that both of you have done an incredible service to first generation students, to early practitioners, to people that, you know, might not have that background or community and kind of have an idea of what professionals in the law do, because both of you and Drew before you kind of produce a really broad library of content that, you know, focused on individuals and their lives moving up through their academic career into their legal careers, as well as you know, focus on different things that the Law Review itself published or certain legal issues. And I think for me, part of my vision is to shift that focus more towards those prominent legal issues and guest perspectives on these issues, while still, you know, there will definitely be some episodes that are kind of covering people's backgrounds and their focus and how they moved up, but shifting the focus more towards the legal issues. And, you know, I think we all know today there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on in the world.
Sure. Yeah, well, I'm super excited to listen to your forthcoming episodes, starting with this one, and hear that deep dive on particular legal issues that are coming up right now in our society. So I'm looking forward to it. I think you're going to do a great job, and we're very excited to be done with law school. Good luck to you, though, in your 3L year, and we really will be listening to the show every episode. No pressure.
Well, hey, looking forward to it, Adri. Thank you. Thanks to Robert, and look forward to taking over and getting to speak with guests and to you all, our listeners. So
Yeah. Well, we have one more question that we have to ask you, which is, are you pro Oxford comma or not, Kevin?
I had a feeling this was coming, and it's funny. I was pretty stern on my answer until our last episode with Jillian Hobson, and so I'm an aspiring transaction attorney. I still have another year and change of law school to go and a bar to pass. But she gave some pretty good reasons to not be pro Oxford comma, and I will say
No.
till this point, it has been the only way I've written lists of things, and so I guess we'll see. I'm not sure.
That's good. It's a good place to be.
I want to jump in real quick and say I'm militantly pro Oxford comma.
Well, we're glad to know that, Robert, because I can finally kick you off the podcast.
Love it.
And with that, goodbye, you guys.
Hello and welcome. This is Emphasis Added, a podcast by the Houston Law Review, where we highlight legal issues, prominent lawyers, and obscure blue book rules. I'm your host, Kevin Donovan. But before we begin, a special thanks to our sponsor, Vincent & Elkins, a global law firm with 11 offices and more than 700 lawyers committed to excellence in serving and advising its sophisticated clients in industries such as energy, finance, technology, real estate, media, and beyond. Beanie lawyers are also proud to support pro bono clients across their communities. To help clients navigate complex areas of law, Beanie hires the best and brightest law students and lawyers, valuing diverse perspectives and backgrounds. Visit www.velaw.com to learn more about Beanie's Summer Associate Program and hiring opportunities. Start your success story at Vincent & Elkins. David R. Dow is a professor at the University of Houston Law Center and the founder of the Texas Innocence Network, an organization that uses UH law students to investigate claims of actual innocence brought by Texas prisoners. Professor Dow is also the author of 7 books and numerous scholarly articles, to include his critically acclaimed book, The Autobiography of an Executioner. Professor Dow's areas of expertise include contracts, constitutional law and theory, and death penalty law. Today I spoke with Professor Dow about his 30 years of experience representing death row inmates and how the inaccuracies, inequalities, and expense of death row sentencing has led to a general decline of the death penalty over the past decade. Professor Dow, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be with you.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And so, how long have you been a death penalty lawyer for?
Oh boy, I started representing my first client 30 years ago. So if you measure from the time that I had my first client, it's been 30 years. If you measure from the time that I had a whole lot of clients on my docket at once, it's probably been more like 20 years.
And how many death row inmates have you represented?
Over that entire time period, I have represented in the neighborhood of 115 or so. Almost all of them have been in Texas. It can be a little bit misleading, I think, for people to hear me say that I've represented 115 guys, because it doesn't mean that I've represented that many throughout the entirety of their death penalty litigation. It just means that I've represented them at one point or another. And maybe we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but one of the reasons that we represent so many people. And I say we because I have a team. I don't do these things by myself. One of the reasons that we represent so many people is that we're the only group of death penalty lawyers who work on what I refer to as crisis litigation. And crisis litigation is just a term that we use in-house. It doesn't mean anything generally, but we use the term crisis litigation to describe cases where the inmate is essentially at the end of the appellate road. He's already gone through direct appeal, he's gone through state habeas, he's gone through federal habeas. And so there may be a way to get back into one of those earlier stages, but you don't know that until you really get into the case. And we will have, I want to say, somewhere between 80 and 95% of death row inmates in Texas who get to that point in their proceedings write us a letter to ask if we can do anything for them. And a lot of those cases we look at, we decide we can do something for the person, but the entire representation might last for 90 or 120 days.
Okay.
Other cases, I'll have clients whose cases we work on for 10 or 11 years. So it really varies very widely from just a matter of weeks to more than a decade.
And is that group of attorneys different than the Texas Innocence Network?
No, it isn't. The Texas Innocence Network has, it isn't now. The
Okay.
Texas Innocence Network has both a capital and a non-capital division, and we have a impermeable Chinese wall between those two
Okay.
because the non-capital division gets funded by sources that don't want to have any fingerprints whatsoever on death penalty cases.
Got it.
And so the capital division, which is part of the Innocence Network, is what works on those cases. And it's been as many as 4 attorneys, but there's also always lots of students and interns who work on these cases with us. For, I want to say about 6 years, I was also the litigation director at an organization called the Texas Defender Service. That organization still exists, but I'm not with them anymore. And so when I was at TDS, there were, oh gosh, probably 8 or 10 different lawyers who I was supervising. So
Got it.
in the aggregate, that was a big number of cases that we were working on.
Yeah. So a plethora of experience.
A
But
plethora of experience.
not to say that you don't do other things, and this is where I want to mention that you also teach contracts, and that's how I know you.
Yes.
Professor Dow was my contracts professor my first year in school, and then I, after that, the following year, tutored for your class, and so just want to say privileged to do that and privileged to have you on the show. But we won't be talking about contracts today. We'll be talking about the death penalty. And in particular, there's some news in the death penalty world as of 24 hours ago, and that's that Virginia, the state with the second most executions in the United States for over the past 50 years, just outlawed the death penalty.
Yeah. Yes. Let me just say, Kevin, that I'm also happy to talk about contracts if you would like. I love contracts. I've been interested in contracts for longer than I've been interested in the death penalty. I got interested in the death penalty by accident. I got interested in contracts because from the time I was in law school, I loved contracts, and I just finished working on a big old contracts case, as a matter of fact. So yeah, I love contracts. But yes, the news in Virginia is, I think, really important because Virginia, as you pointed out, is second only to Texas in terms of the number of executions that have been carried out in the modern era. The reality is that in recent years, and by recent, I mean the last 5 or 10, the number of new death sentences in Virginia has dropped to almost 0. To some extent, the Virginia experience is true elsewhere. The number of new death sentences in Texas has also dropped quite dramatically. In the mid 1990s, say, there would be, in a normal year, 30 new arrivals on death row. New arrivals are just what we refer to as people who get sentenced to death, and then they're a new arrival. And in the mid 90s, there would be 30 or so a year. I think at the high point, there were 36 or 37, maybe even 38. That's, when you think about it, that's pretty extraordinary. I mean, that's 3 new death sentences a month across the state. That's a lot.
Yeah.
In recent years, those numbers have been single digits. Last year was 7, the year before that was 8, the year before that was 8, something like that. So we've gone from 30, 35 a year to 7, 8, 9 a year, even in Texas. And in Virginia, that drop was every bit as steep. So I think that it's very, very important that Virginia has joined the abolitionist camp, because Virginia has carried out so many executions. And one way, of course, to measure the activity of a state is by measuring the number of executions in that state. Another way, of course, that one could measure it is how many people is that state continuing to send to death row. And in Virginia, as is in Texas, that number has dropped very dramatically.
Right, right, and I think I'll save maybe why that's happening for as we
Okay.
get through what the death penalty looks like as a system, as a process, and kind of get into that. But I wanted to kind of frame our conversation today around a statement from the Virginia governor, which I think is going to lend some credence to what you're saying about the decline of the death penalty. Upon signing his legislation, he said, "We can't give out the ultimate punishment without being 100% sure that we're right, and we can't sentence people to that ultimate punishment knowing that the system doesn't work the same for everyone." And so I think in that statement you have two things which I would presume from everything I've researched are the primary kind of pillars for why death penalty abolition exists. And before we get into it, I just want to recap. I think for many Americans, the reason to support the death penalty, they're fairly innate. They're natural. A sense of, Hammurabi-esque eye for an eye justice, a general fear that murderers may re-enter society, or retribution for victims' families, crime deterrence. But I think what requires more insight is understanding why some innocent people still end up being executed, and why the system doesn't work the same for everyone. And so I think today, if we can talk about how the death penalty is actually implemented, then we can shed some light on what Governor Northam of Virginia is saying when he made that statement. And so I don't know if you can hear that crazy noise in the background there.
Yeah, it's not bothering me. I'm accustomed to crazy noises. I've now been teaching by Zoom for a year, so I'm used to hearing things. I think that the governor's statement is very interesting, and he identifies two different themes, really. And to my mind, one of them is much more important than the other as a matter of justice, but the other one is much more important as a matter of impact. The two themes that he identifies are, first, the fact that you end up with innocent people on death row. That's incontestably true. There are some
Right.
people who will debate whether an innocent person has ever been executed, but there's nobody who will debate whether innocent people have been sent to death row. And so that's the first thing that he mentions. And then the second thing that he mentions is that the process that identifies who it is that ends up on death row is a flawed process. And just to give some numerical context to that, in the United States, in a given year, there are somewhere between 15 and 20,000 homicides. The United States is just a very violent place. Now, obviously, not all homicides are violent in the sense of the homicides that occurred 2 days ago in Boulder, Colorado. It's a homicide when a drunk driver plows through an intersection and runs over a family and kills the family. That's homicide too. But 15 to 20,000 homicides is a lot.
Right.
And as we were just talking about, the number of new arrivals on death row is dropping precipitously. The number of executions nationwide is dropping precipitously. And so what you end up seeing is it's something like 0.5 to 1% of the people who committed a homicide that could have resulted in their execution are in fact executed.
Right.
If you could go to Las Vegas and have a 99 or 99.5% chance of winning, we'd all be billionaires,
I
right?
like those odds in Vegas.
Exactly. And so if you're somebody who wants to solve a problem that you have by committing homicide, and you've got a 99 to 99.5% chance of being able to commit that homicide and not have to worry about facing the death penalty yourself, lots of rational people are going to do that. So who is this 1% or so of people who are eligible for death sentences who, in fact, face the death penalty trial and then get sentenced to death? And I think that's the second theme
Right.
that Governor Northam has identified. That what we would like the answer to that question to be, because what the death penalty cases tell you it ought to be, is that those cases are the worst of the worst. It's the Boston Marathon bomber. It's the person who shot up all of the massage venues in Georgia last week. It's the person who walked into the grocery store in Boulder, Colorado. In reality, there's not any rhyme or reason to it. Some people who commit an unexceptional homicide. What I mean by unexceptional is just that you have to read about 12 or 14 pages into the local newspaper before you even get to the story. People commit those kind of homicides are people who end up on death row, and some people who commit page one homicides, they don't. And so we can talk about how that happens. That happens for a variety of reasons that are not good reasons. They're having to do with the quality of the lawyer. They're having to do with the race or ethnicity of the defendant. They have to do with the race or ethnicity of the victim. They have to do with the wealth of the defendant. Can you hire a great lawyer? Or are you counting on the state to pay for your defense bills? And I think that's really the second theme
Right.
of Governor Northam's statement.
Well, to tackle the first theme first, because I think it's the one that most people are familiar with, and should take probably a little less of our analysis, is that first theme of those that are innocent, that are, I suppose, maybe let free, but also executed likely. How likely is it that a death row convict is innocent in the first case?
Obviously, that's an impossible question to answer. We don't know. We can't know. We can't know the answer to that because we have imperfect information about that. When a
Right.
jury decides somebody is guilty of having committed a crime, the jury is deciding that the state has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that the person did what he is accused of. And I keep saying he, Kevin, and I should just interrupt myself at this point to say that it would be precious of me to be saying he or she every time I talk about a death row inmate. 98% of the people on death row are men. So I use the masculine pronoun simply because that reflects the reality of it. So that when a jury decides that somebody has committed the crime, they're deciding that the person they think did it. Can juries be wrong? Absolutely. Juries can be wrong. And sometimes these people get executed. And how many innocent people have been executed? I don't know. How many innocent people are on death row? I don't know that either. What I can tell you is that the most rigorous attempt to answer that question in the last 10 years is a paper that was published by a law professor at Michigan named Sam Gross and his team. And they concluded, based on what we know, and I'm going to tell you what we know in just a second, but they concluded based on what we know that it is probable that 8% of people on death row are innocent. And here's what I mean by what we know. What I mean by what we know is people who were sentenced to death and subsequently exonerated on the basis of the gold standard of forensic evidence, which is DNA analysis. To the extent that human beings can be sure about anything, you could be sure if DNA excludes somebody as a perpetrator of a crime that that person didn't do it. And so what Professor Gross and his team did was they looked at all of these exonerations and then they extrapolated from that number to the current death row population and conclude that around 8% of the inmates on death row are innocent. A pretty extraordinary statistic is that that for every 10 people who have been executed in the modern era in the United States, okay, one has been released from prison. That's kind of mind-boggling.
Wow.
It's like when you tell people that the criminal justice system has that kind of error rate, people, I think, are stunned. And
Yeah.
there's nobody I know who would get onto an airplane if there was a 10% chance that the airplane was going to crash and kill everybody on it before it reached its destination. People just wouldn't. But that's the criminal justice system. That's a really high tolerance for error rate that we have.
Right. And so you've represented over 100 clients in the past, and admittedly, some or many of them are murderers and are accused of their acts. But you obviously have another branch of the Texas Innocence Network that seeks out claims of innocence. How many of your clients do you truly believe were innocent that were sentenced to death?
Thanks for that question. My personal experience more or less maps very closely onto the findings of Professor Gross and his colleagues. I've represented 8 or 9 people who I think are innocent. Two of those people walked out of prison. Sorry, 3 of those people have walked out of prison. One of them died in prison from natural causes before we could establish that he was innocent. 3 of them were executed because I couldn't manage to persuade the people whose opinion matters that they're actually innocent. And then one of them, the case is still ongoing. So, we'll see what happens. So, 8 out of 110 or so is not quite 8%, which is Sam Gross's number, but it's in that same ballpark. Um, and I don't have any reason to think that my experience in that domain is terribly different from the experience of any other death penalty lawyer who's represented a significant number of guys.
Yeah, and that is, I think that's a shocking number for many.
It is a shocking number. I would say a couple of things about that, Kevin. One is that I think that number is in part responsible for why we have seen such a precipitous decline in the number of new death penalty cases. And maybe we'll talk about what all of those factors are. But I certainly think that one of the factors, and in my view, probably the most important factor, is those exonerations. And the reason is that the criminal justice system is dynamic. If you asked people who serve on juries 30 years ago what their impressions were of the criminal justice system, they would say, if the police arrested the person and the prosecutors are prosecuting the person, I think the person probably did it. And yes, I can be fair and I can be impartial and I can weigh all the evidence, but I think that if the police arrested him and the prosecutors are prosecuting him, that's a pretty good indication that the person did it. And now here we are in 2021, and there's not a person alive who is able to read who doesn't know about stories of exoneration. And so what that means is that the jury pool, which is just all those people out there who consume news, when they go to the jury assembly room now as compared to 30 years ago, they don't look at the police and prosecutors and think, oh my gosh, if the person got arrested in a standing trial, the person probably did it, because they know about all of these exonerations that they've read
Right.
about in the newspaper, that they've seen on the TV news shows. And so now they're on the jury. And if you're a defense lawyer, that's who you want on the jury, because you want people who are actually skeptical. And so what happens if a jury is skeptical? If a jury is skeptical, you have a greater chance, not necessarily of an acquittal in a death penalty case, because at least in my experience, the evidence of guilt in most death penalty cases is pretty compelling. But even when the evidence is pretty compelling, you might just hedge your bet when it comes to the sentence. And you might think, I'm 98% sure that this guy did it, but I'm not 100% sure. And so I'm going to sentence this person to life rather than death, because if I'm wrong, I don't want to be responsible for sentencing this person to death. And so what does that mean? That means that you have jurors returning life sentences where 30 years ago they would have returned a death sentence. Okay, so what is the dynamic effect of that? Well, the dynamic effect of that is that the prosecutors now, they were seeking a death penalty and they got a life sentence. Why did they get a life sentence? Because we had these exonerations in all of these other cases. And so now the prosecutors go back to their office and they've just spent $2 million, $2.5 million chasing a death sentence that they didn't get. And they could have gotten the exact same outcome, which is life in prison, if they had taken a plea and that would have cost them $20,000. So now the county, because the county's on the hook for that money, the county has now spent a couple $1 million that it didn't have to spend. And so that makes you really reluctant the next time you have one of those cases, if you're the prosecutor, to roll those dice again, because you've already been burned once. And so now prosecutors become more selective. So it just becomes really, I think, a reinforcing dynamic. And I think that's what we saw in Virginia.
Okay.
And it got to the point that you're getting death sentences so infrequently that why even bother keeping this punishment anymore? We just don't need it.
Right. And I think that's part of the money expense side of things that a lot of people don't think about. That's definitely not something that I've thought about, is just the cost of having to try the case and everything. Obviously, if you're being accused of the death penalty, you're not going to settle. You know.
Right, exactly. There are 254 counties in Texas. Okay, more than half those counties have never sent somebody to death row. Okay, why? Because they're small counties; they don't have a ton of money, and so even if you have a homicide in Kermit County, you're not going to seek a death sentence in that case in Kermit County because it's going to cost you $5 million, and that's money that you use to pay school teachers, and that you use to fill potholes in the road, and that you use to pay police officers and teachers. So you've got a fixed amount of money in the budget, and you have somebody who committed a horrible crime. These are horrible crimes. You have somebody who committed a horrible crime in your jurisdiction. And so the two choices are, I can either seek a death sentence and maybe the person gets executed in 10 years, or I can send that person to prison for the rest of his life and he's never going to get out because it's going to be a true life sentence. And that's going to cost me $20,000, and the death sentence is going to cost me $3 million. What are you going to do?
Right.
If you're the person who has to answer to the voters for how you spend the county budget, that is the explanation for why so many counties have never chased a death sentence, because it simply doesn't make any economic sense. And the people who are in charge of the budget in those counties are not going to want to have to go to explain to the voters why they spent $3 million doing something that they could have gotten for 20,000.
And I guess that explains in a way maybe why, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Harris County has what the most executions in the country, right? As a county, which is where Houston resides. Houston's a very large city. And yeah, I mean, I wasn't really sure why our county happened to kind of fall in that line. And I suppose the expense side of things maybe explains that.
If Harris County were a state, it would be second on the list of executions, trailing only Texas. Virginia would be third. So
wow.
Harris County executes a lot of people. It's a big city. People sometimes ask me, why does Texas as a whole and Harris County in particular execute many people? And I'll tell you what I tell them. It sounds flip, but it'll only sound flip until I explain it. I say Harris County executes so many people because Harris County executes so many people. That's why. And that sounds flip, but what I mean by that is that the death penalty is like anything else in life, which is that the more you do it, the better you get at it. And in Harris County, every single part, and in Texas for that matter, every single part of the system is an expert. The defense lawyers, experts. The district attorneys, experts. The attorney generals, experts. The state court judges, experts. The federal judges, experts. The prison officials who have to transport inmates, experts. The prison officials who have to carry out executions, experts. The governor's office that has to review last-minute requests for reprieves, experts. That's a lot of moving parts. If I have a case in another state, and I've had cases in other states, and 4 or 5 days before an execution, I notice a new issue that nobody's litigated before and that I think I can litigate, and I think I have a jurisdictional basis to get back into court, and I file something. The lawyers in that state, they haven't seen that before. The district attorney's office, they haven't seen it. Attorney general's office, they haven't seen it. State court judge hadn't seen it. And so it takes them time. It probably means that my execution is not going to happen at the scheduled time because my case can't wind its way through the system in time. In Texas, if I have somebody who is scheduled to be executed tonight at 6 o'clock, and here it is 3 p.m, I discover an issue that I want to raise, and I write up the issue and I rush it into state court or federal court. Every single player in the system has done this before, has seen this before. a dozen times, 2 dozen times. And so the execution might actually still happen
Right.
today, even though I don't file something till 3 in the afternoon because the people are so good at it. Now that raises the question of why did these people get so good at it? And in other words, to get so good at it, it had to execute a lot of people. Why did it start in the first place executing so many people? And I don't know the answer to that. I've never heard an explanation that seems obviously correct to me. Some people describe the frontier mentality in Texas. I suppose it could be that, although I don't exactly know what that means. I think what the more likely explanation is that the Texas death penalty system is very decentralized. So in other states, there is a central administration of the death penalty. In Texas, every death penalty is different depending on what county the case comes from. And what that means is that local county officials are the ones who decide whether to set an execution date and when to seek an execution date. And so if you have people on death row from 100 or 110 or 120 different Texas counties, it means that there's 100 or 110 different district attorneys that are deciding, do we want to set an execution date in this case yet? And there's no centralization to it. And so I think that is probably a better explanation than just about anything else I've heard. But even that's not a particularly great explanation. I just don't think that anybody knows what the answer is.
Got it. Got it. Thank you. And so that explains Texas, but I suppose it doesn't explain the country as a whole, and maybe not why people are executed in the first place, but I think Governor Northam said that the system doesn't treat people fairly. And so I know we've talked about innocence, and we've talked about that first part of the trial, and we've talked a little bit about that second part of a trial, but in that sentencing phase, what is it about it that people that lacks fairness?
What lacks fairness is that people are sentenced to death based on three factors that most people would think should be irrelevant to the criminal justice system. One is, what is their race or ethnicity? One is, what is the race or ethnicity of the person they killed? And one is, how much money do they have? So the wealth of the defendant, the race of the defendant, the race of the victim. And I think that intuitively, most people think that those factors should not matter in the criminal justice system. Look, we live in a capitalist society, and I understand that, and I'm not a socialist, and so I think that capitalism is on balance good, even though it creates inequality. It means that if you've got a whole lot of money, you can take a private plane wherever you want to go, and if you don't have a lot of money, you got to take the bus. And if you have a lot of money, you can eat steak and caviar for dinner, and if you don't have a lot of money, eat bologna sandwiches. I recognize all of that. There's a price that we pay for having a market economy, and one of those prices is that we have inequality. And I think that even most recently in the COVID experience, we've seen that people who have wealth and access are having access to better medical care and attention than people who have less access to those things. And so we tolerate these sorts of inequalities across almost every social domain. But I think the one place where those disparities are not supposed to matter is in the criminal justice system. That's why under the Supreme Court, it says equal justice under law. Everybody's supposed to be the same. And so once you discover that you're not the same in the criminal justice system, that people who have money are better off than people who don't, that people who are white are better off than people who are of color, it really causes you to pause and think we maybe need to make some real adjustments here in a way that we're not necessarily inclined to do when it comes to the fact that some people have to take the bus and some people get to fly on private jets. And I think that that is what the governor had in mind. That's certainly my experience. And to the extent that those sorts of factors are not only playing a significant role, but often playing a determinative role in the death penalty that we have in America, that makes the system intolerable. I'll just mention one quick example to you. There, nationwide, there's something like 2,600 people on death row, and most homicides are intraracial. That is, most white people are killed by a white guy, most black people killed by a black guy, most Hispanics killed by a Hispanic. It's not 100% true, it's mostly true. Blacks and whites are victims of homicide in about equal number, even though blacks only make up a third of the population, less than a third of the population. Blacks and whites are victims of homicide in equal number. Yet the number of blacks on death row nationwide equals the number of whites on death row. That should not be true. There should be a third more white people on death row, taking all of these other factors into consideration, but there aren't. Well, why not? Well, there's only two factors that explain it. One is race, and one is that people of color are disproportionately represented in the lower income strata. Those are the only two factors that explain it. And so if that's the criminal justice system that you have, and you care about racial equality, you care about economic equality, then you are inevitably forced to the conclusion that the death penalty system is simply intolerable. It's morally and ethically intolerable.
And what is it about wealth? I mean, constitutionally all people are allowed to have a lawyer, right? So what is it about money that disadvantages poor people with the death penalty in particular?
What it is about money is that if you are indigent, you are relying on either a public defender or a private lawyer who's appointed to represent you. And in Texas, there is not a statewide public defender office that represents indigent defendants who are facing a death sentence. And so what that means is that indigent capital defendants are getting a private court-appointed lawyer. Some of those lawyers are very good. I would not have said that 25 years ago. But today I will say that some of those lawyers are very good. But it does not matter how good you are if you don't have the resources to do all of the thorough type of investigation that a lawyer retained by somebody who has a whole lot of money can do. You're probably too young to remember, and probably most of the people who are listening to this are too young to remember, but O.J. Simpson had a trial at which he was on trial for killing two people. Right. And he had what was called the dream team of lawyers. He had Johnny Cochran, he had Barry Scheck, he had F. Lee Bailey, he had Peter Neufeld. He had more lawyers than could fit at counsel table. And the lawyers were great, but it was not just the lawyers. He had investigators that you don't even know about because they're not household names. And you have to have a whole lot of money to be able to assemble a team like that. And there's nobody who is an indigent defendant in Texas who gets that kind of money. You get two lawyers appointed to represent you, but there's a presumptive cap on the amount of money that the county is going to pay them. And once that cap is reached, maybe the lawyers are going to get paid if they spend additional money, and maybe they're not. And so if you're a lawyer, and the reason you're a lawyer is because it's how you earn your living, it's how you pay the mortgage, it's how you buy the groceries, it's how you keep the lights on, you're not going to go into a hole in a case. You're not going to spend $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 conducting an investigation that maybe you're not going to get paid back for. And so what will happen when you have a wealthy defendant who can pay a lawyer to do all of those things will often not happen when you have an indigent defendant who's forced to rely on the county. The lawyer is perfectly good. If the lawyer had all that money at her disposal, she would spend it in a good way, but she doesn't. And so what I tell people is you can have Clarence Darrow representing you, but if Clarence Darrow doesn't have any money to go conduct the investigation that has to be conducted for a trial lawyer to be prepared to try the case, then you're going to get convicted and sentenced to death, notwithstanding the fact that you got Clarence Darrow representing you. And indigent defendants don't have those kind of resources to pay for that investigation.
Right. And I think they did have a documentary on O.J. Simpson, so I understood the reference.
Okay.
Netflix did, so I understood the reference. But
Yeah, I watched, even though I watched the trial when it happened, I watched that documentary. It's an excellent documentary.
it was good, right? If
Yeah,
the glove don't
excellent
fit.
documentary.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I mean that's really really interesting, and it explains so much about why. I mean, obviously, I'm sure you could talk for days about, especially 25 years ago, the stories of attorneys that maybe weren't up to the task in money and material. But I mean, talking about just that income cap, it doesn't matter how good of an attorney you are, and so I think that's really
Yeah, that's
fascinating.
right. And I also I want to say that, that even 25 years ago there were some lawyers who were perfectly fine lawyers.
Right.
The problem is that there was not a specialized death penalty bar 30 years ago. Today there is.
Okay.
And 30 years ago there was not a specialized death penalty bar. And so the people who did death penalty cases were just ordinary criminal defense lawyers.
Right.
And there is a world of difference between an ordinary criminal trial and a death penalty trial. There's a world of difference. And you might have 15, 20, 25 felonies that you've tried to verdict in non-capital cases. And your first death penalty case is still going to be a completely different experience. And
Right.
30 years ago, the people who were being drafted to represent the guys facing possible death sentences were just ordinary criminal lawyers. There wasn't a specialized bar. And so now there's a specialized bar, and it's just made a big difference.
Okay. And so I'd like to transition here from, so we talked about the trial. We've talked about people being convicted, sentenced, what these people look like. But what does death row look like itself? You've, I'm sure, spent time there meeting with clients over the past. I mean, what does the life of a death row inmate look like?
Bleak. Death row inmates in Texas since 20 years ago have been housed at a prison unit. It's now called the Polunsky unit. It used to be called the Terrell unit, but it's the same prison. It just has a different name. And they spend, on a good day for an inmate, they spend 23 hours a day in a cell all by themselves. The cell doesn't have bars. It's got solid walls all the way around. There's like a slit of a window that lets in outside light. And they're supposed to be taken for showers 3 days a week. They're supposed to have an hour a day of solitary exercise where they get moved from their cell into what's euphemistically known as a day room, which is just a bigger cage. Instead of being 65 square feet, it's about 150 square feet, so that you can walk around the perimeter of it. But I say that's on a good day. On a typical week, instead of getting taken outside their cell for recreation every day, maybe they get taken outside for recreation 3 or 4 days. And this is all if they're well behaved. If they're not well behaved and they get bumped up to what's called level, then they have privileges taken away. So they have showers taken away, they have day room privileges taken away, they have commissary taken away. Death row inmates don't have televisions. There's no internet access. It's not like you see on TV where they go out into the rec yard and they've got weight rooms like, fancy gyms and things like that. There isn't any of that. So it's a pretty bleak existence. They have a certain number of hours that they are allotted per week where they can visit with visitors outside of their cell. They get brought into a visiting area. They don't have contact visits with the visitors, so they're talking to their visitor through on a telephone through plastic glass. There are not limits on attorney visits. An attorney can visit his client as frequently as the lawyer needs to, but there are limits on what are called social visits. So if you're an inmate, you have children, you have a spouse, you have parents, limits on how frequently you can see them, and then for how many hours at a time you can see them. So it's not a comfortable life. Now there are people who would say, "Hey, they killed somebody. They shouldn't have a comfortable life," and that I understand that. I understand that. But at the same time, it's a myth to suggest that they have a life that any rational person would choose.
And can they work at all? Like I know what normal prisoner Gen Pop can work and kind of still contribute to society, right?
Correct. Prior to the time that death row was moved from what was called the Ellis unit. It is still called the Ellis unit in Huntsville to where it is right now, the Polunsky unit. Death row inmates, in fact, had work privileges. So they worked in the laundry, they worked making license plates. But at the current facility, they do not have work privileges. So no, they can't work. They spend all day, every day, alone in their cells, no contact with any other human beings. The only people who touch them are prison guards. Those are the only people they have physical contact with, and they're lawyers if they have a court hearing. But if they don't have a court hearing, once they go to death row, the only people who are ever going to touch them while they're still alive are prison guards.
And I'm assuming then that they also eat in their cell as well. They just get served that food from the guards and everything.
They get served breakfast through what is called a bean hole, which is a slot that the guards open up to slide through a tray. They get breakfast at 4 in the morning. They get lunch at 10 in the morning. They get dinner at 4 in the afternoon.
Right. Because, I mean, you think you already said, like, regardless of whether or not you think murderers deserve this, I mean, this must be incredibly expensive. Not only can they not work and provide some sort of, I suppose, income or revenue for the prisons, but, I mean, they also have to have everything given to them from the guards. I mean, they're not allowed to leave.
Yeah, of course, the costs are sunk in terms of the facility. Right? I mean, the prison facility is there, so that's a sunk cost.
Right.
The advantage of keeping prisoners in their cells all day is that it reduces the number of guards that you need to watch them when they're not in their cell.
Okay.
You can have a single guard who walks up and down the pod looking through windows, whereas if you had inmates coming in and out of their cells, you'd need more guards. The reality is that guards are paid nothing. And so the cost of security, it's scandalous how little prison guards are paid. They've got important and dangerous jobs, and they're paid very little money. So the actual cost of housing an inmate on death row is pretty low. A student of mine and I tried to do a back of the envelope type of calculation a few years ago, and we concluded that it costs about $25,000 a year to house an inmate in a maximum security facility.
And how does that
have somebody?
How does that compare to a life in prison?
It would cost about the same.
Okay.
I mean, it would cost slightly more if they were in life in prison, if they had opportunities to be outside of their cells,
right?
Because you're going to have more guards in a setting where you have inmates who are mingling than when you don't. But it's still a pretty small number. It's certainly well south of $30,000 a year. So even at the high number of $30,000 a year, somebody in prison for 50 years. Which that's a long time to live in prison because lifespans are shorter in prison. The food is bad, the healthcare is bad, and prisons are violent. But even if you manage to live for 50 years in prison, at 30 grand a year costs you $1.5 million to keep somebody in prison for the rest of his life. That's less than the cost of that's less than it costs for a death penalty trial.
Right.
For a trial, it's less.
And so it's the trial where the huge differential in expenses then.
That's correct. And people sometimes say, oh, well, if you don't want to spend all that money on these death penalty cases, let's just get rid of all the appeals. And I understand why people would think that, but 80% of the death penalty costs are front loaded. They are spent between the time the person is arrested and the time the person is sentenced to death. So even if you took the person outside behind the courthouse right after the jury came back with a death sentence and shot him, you would still be spending 80% of what we spend on current death penalty cases. The appeals are just comparatively dimes on the dollar.
Right. And that's really, I mean, the appeals are the only hope you have left, right? Once you're sentenced to death. And that's kind of the other part of what the Texas Innocence Network does, that you were saying you and a group of attorneys do, is that appeals process, right?
We do at the Texas Innocence Network, my team and I do exclusively appeals. The only time we do trials is when we win on an appeal and get somebody a new trial.
Okay.
And even then, we're probably not going to do the trial ourselves. We don't have a big enough staff and a big enough budget.
Got it.
To do the trial ourselves. So we might try to plea it. And if we don't succeed in pleading it, then we're probably going to get out of the case and somebody else is going to try it.
So what do those appeals look like? I mean, is there any hope? Is it something that you often get cases overturned or?
I wouldn't say often. Um, I would say that we have had, in my experience, in my history, we've had probably 25 guys or so who we have won, which means I mentioned earlier 2 guys who walked out of prison. Most victories are not somebody walking out of prison. Most victories
Right.
are somebody gets moved from death row to general prison population. So we get rid of their death sentence and they're going to have a life sentence instead. And we've, I guess, have about 25 cases where we've had that kind of success. And then we have lots and lots of cases where we extend people's lives. Um, and by extending people's lives, I just mean that they live longer because of the work that we are doing than they would live otherwise. And maybe it's an additional 3 months. In some cases, it's an additional 15 years. And so I don't know if you can count that as a victory in any large sense of the word victory, but if you're a human being who likes being alive and you get to enjoy your life and visiting with your family and your friends that you've met in prison and out of prison, and you get to enjoy that experience for an additional decade or so, uh, it's not exactly a victory in the capital V sense of the word victory, but it's something that I think we have done to serve our clients.
Absolutely. And it's I mean it's really interesting. I feel like we could probably dive into the appeals process a lot more, but for the sake of time, I think we'll probably avoid it, and I think maybe start to wrap up. And one of the things from your book, The Autobiography of an Executioner, one of the quotes I took from it that I thought was really interesting was that support for the death penalty is a mile wide, but only an inch thin. I think that quote, especially today, especially in the past year since the killing of George Floyd and the social justice movements that have kind of started advocating for criminal justice reform, are starting to show. I know that you've said there's been a decline. And so I wanted to ask you, do you foresee the death penalty being completely abolished in your lifetime?
First of all, Kevin, I just want to tell you, I stole that line from Sister Helen Prejean. She says the death penalty is a mile wide, only an inch deep. And when she said that, I said, yeah, but you can drown in an inch of water. Um, but what she means by that, and what I meant by that, is that people support it because they don't know anything about it.
Right.
It's easy to support something you don't know anything about. And I think that the more people learn about it, the less they support it. And that's what she means by an inch deep. Let me tell you about how the system really works. And that support, it just doesn't have deep roots. And so if your question is, do I think the death penalty is going to be abolished? I would say absolutely yes, no question about it. I mean, Virginia got rid of the death penalty yesterday. If it can be abolished in Virginia, it can be abolished in Texas. Is it going to happen in my lifetime? I don't know. My predictions are terrible. I told my wife 10 years ago, I told my wife, I said, the death penalty is about to be abolished. I need to find something else to do. I'm thinking I'm going to go work on cases representing people in the LGBTQ community and help work on same-sex marriage. Okay. And now here we are 10 years later, and we've got same-sex marriage in 50 states, and we still have the death penalty. So my kind of sense of historical time when it comes to these big issues is extremely suspect. That said, yeah, we're absolutely going to get rid of the death penalty because I think, as Sister Helen says, the reason people support it is because they know very little about it. The more you know about it, the less comfortable you are with it. And we see that happening in more and more and more and more places. Texas will be last to go. I'm confident of that. Texas will be last to go. But even in Texas, I don't necessarily think it's going to be because people have a moral awakening. And I also happen to think, we didn't talk about this, and I know we're about out of time, but I also happen to think that it's not possible to persuade people who have a moral commitment to the death penalty that the death penalty is wrong. They have a moral commitment to the death penalty. And I think that death penalty opponents have to respect that some people have a moral commitment to the death penalty. However, at the same time, even when you have a moral commitment to something, it doesn't mean that you're willing to spend a bottomless wallet in order to chase it.
Right.
And so even people who support the death penalty for some moral or religious or ethical reason are given pause if you say, okay, we can pursue a death penalty, but it means that we're not going to be able to buy laptops for kids in schools, or we're going to have to lay off high school teachers. Think, oh, life is a choice. And I might support the death penalty, but I don't support it so much that I want my kids not to have a math teacher. And so I have long believed that the way that the death penalty is going to end, particularly in Texas, where people care about budgets, is to explain to people that you can keep society every single bit as safe as it is with the death penalty without having the death penalty. So if the goal is that we want society to be safe, I can guarantee that our society will be just as safe tomorrow if we don't have the death penalty as it is today when we do have the death penalty. And the only difference is that we're going to have an extra $50 million in the state budget that we can spend on other things. That to me is an argument that appeals even to people who have a moral commitment to the death penalty. And I'm indifferent. I'm against the death penalty. I don't care whether somebody decides that she's against the death penalty for ethical reasons or economic reasons. Either one gets us to the same endpoint.
And if it does end, I think your 10 years ago alternative maybe doesn't exist. What would you do now? What's next?
I like writing books. I'd spend more time writing books. I'd spend more time on my mountain bike.
That's I like that. That's an honest answer.
Yeah.
And I think it's maybe one that's well earned.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for being on the show today, Professor Dow. We have one final question that we ask all of our guests. And that question is, are you pro Oxford comma or not?
I think that anybody who answers that question.
I think I know your answer, by the way. I think I know it, but
What's my answer? What's my answer?
You're pro. Yeah.
There's no respectable contrary argument.
I had a feeling of when I was.
I mean, there's certain questions where reasonable people can disagree, but the Oxford comma is not one of them.
That's I like that answer. Thank you so much, Professor Dow. I really appreciate having you on the show, and take care. And I'm sure I'll see you when we're back on campus again.
You're welcome. It was a real pleasure. And yes, we'll see each other on campus.
Thanks for listening. Emphasis Added is a podcast by the Houston Law Review. Production is possible because of generous support from the Houston Law Review Alumni Association. If you have any thoughts on today's episode or suggestions for future episodes, email us at emphasis@houstonlawreview.org. Follow the Houston Law Review on Twitter and Instagram at HoustonLRev, or find us on Facebook under the name Houston Law Review. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a 5-star review.